Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really, really thrilled to be here. I'm really loving my time in Hamilton, I have to say, so thank you. So I'm going to talk about this novel, Once We Were Home. I'm going to start, I think, though, with something of my journey into the writing life. It's true, I was trained in philosophy and was, immersed in questions about the nature of self and the ways in which a self can be ambivalent, can be fractured in certain ways, but with a backdrop of a lot of people thinking about how you can reach harmony in the self and sort of an ideal self of sorts. And I kept thinking, I don't know that harmonious self that well, and looking at the kind of ways in which you might be ambivalent about things. And but what's interesting is that this was a pretty heady enterprise, and then we had our first daughter, and our daughter was diagnosed deaf at birth. And this was very surprising. We just hadn't expected it. You read parenting books and what to expect, etc. And deafness just was out of left field. But one thing is that in the shock of it, I started journaling to try to understand my feelings and thoughts and to research and what communication pathways we might take with our child. And that journaling opened up a totally new world for me, like of expressive writing, of emotional writing, and that those sort of snippets from some of that journaling ultimately became a memoir, If a Tree Falls. So there's that philosopher. One thing is that as I researched into our family, I learned of these deaf great-great-aunts that, there were deaf people in my family I didn't know anything about until the deafness diagnosis with our daughter. And we learned, one kind of really interesting anecdote was that these two great-great-aunts who were sisters, just like in the end we had two deaf daughters, two sisters, in the shtetl in Galicia, when they would put their babies to bed, they would tie a string from their wrist to their baby's wrist at night, so that in the darkness, when the baby would cry, they would feel a tug on their wrist and they'd wake up to care for their children. And this was this sort of remarkable innovation of hearing, of how to hear another person in this way, how to mother, how to connect. And I'll say one thing, which is that I started when I was working on the memoir, I was thinking about how we were raising our children in this world and how these two great aunts were, growing up deaf in the 1800s in Galicia, and I was weaving together these stories of these two sets of deaf sisters. And I went to a writing workshop in Iowa City for the Summer Writing Festival, and I met a writing teacher in the parking lot. She wasn't even my teacher, but she said, we were on our way to some wine and cheese reception, and she said, what are you working on? And I said, well, I'm trying to weave together these two stories of deaf sisters. And she's like, yeah, but so what's it about? I was like, these two sets of sisters? You just have to, And ultimately, when I told her the anecdote about the string, she's like, so how was it with your mom? And, do you feel like, basically learned that there was this other braid that I didn't even know about, and that really I was wondering whether, did I have a string from my mom to me, and would I have a string to connect from myself to my daughters, and sort of understood that ultimately, at first, when I thought the issue was whether our kids would hear, I learned that it was really would I hear them. And so one thing that writing for me has done is it just turns things on its head, and it opens things up, and I may not know what I'm doing right at the start, but ultimately there's something I'm learning, and what brings you to your writing desk every day is something I want to talk about with respect to Once We Were Home, because I was actually presenting the memoir to a group of people, and I said that we gave our children hearing technology and we were encouraging their every vocalization, and a woman in the audience described her childhood of having to stay completely silent for 24 months in a shoemaker's attic with her mom during World War II. And the idea of this child having to stay silent and of a mother having to silence her child like that. And it was in juxtaposition of us encouraging every sound and trying to kind of give this open life to our kids. I just couldn't stop thinking about that woman, and I ended up interviewing her and interviewing many other hidden children of the Holocaust. And while I was, ultimately a book came out, for me that was about a young girl who was a musical prodigy. She was a violinist, which is a stringed instrument. She was calling out in the night for her mother in The Yellow Bird Sings. something like that string motif running through that work. And then while I, as interviewing one of these hidden children, he said, you might want to talk to my wife. And the wife told me her story, which was that she had survived the Holocaust in a Siberian labor camp. She returned to Poland, and something just like 3% of Jewish children had survived, and most of them in Christian settings with assumed identities, different Christian names, etc., hiding. And a mission kind of grew to try to retrieve those children, to try to take back any Jewish child anywhere, and repopulate Judaism after so much annihilation. And as I talked to her, it was really interesting. She saw it as saving the children and saving Judaism. And I think in many ways it was, definitely an effort to save Judaism. I think the people who did this work, the operatives who tried to retrieve Jewish children after the war, not only were trying to rebuild this collective that had been annihilated, but also trying to honor the dying wishes of their parents who stowed their children in a Christian setting to live, just for this time until they could come back. But they, in the end, didn't come back, but they hadn't stowed them there so that they would be raised, in this Christian family, but hoped they would, come back to their own community. And so the operatives, I think, were working in some sense with this sense that they would be, it would be right to be taking those children back into Judaism. And finally, Poland especially was incredibly anti-Semitic after the war, and the idea that some of these, operatives who had survived the Holocaust, they might have gone by themselves maybe to try to get transport to Palestine, but to leave children in these settings felt very nerve-wracking, because even if the family was, like a loving family or whatever, they had villagers and neighbors, and they just couldn't trust the situation, and they were very worried. So, I was sort of stewing around with this idea of this woman who told me her story, which in detail had to do with her going into taverns, buying drinks, loosening lips, and then asking if any children had arrived during the war. So if a child had arrived into a village in 1942 when many ghettos were being liquidated, there was a chance that that was a Jewish child now. Maybe they were being passed off as a nephew, niece, or whatever, but it was likely. And other different ways of trying to find the Jewish children. And then they would go to the families and offer money, which was supplied by various sources. And and many times these families were incredibly poor. They were trying to, add this extra mouth to feed, and sometimes they did just take the money and give up the child. But when they refused, the woman said to me, so we'd wait until dusk and go into the field and we'd take the children. And they were just going to get the children. They needed to get the children. They felt very pressed to get them. It was like a moral imperative. And I was thinking a lot about the children themselves and what that must have been like, because they had this rupture of losing their very first family. They were stowed in this other place for safekeeping. Their parents didn't make it. And now they were ensconced in this new home. And then these operatives came and said, well, we want to take you back into Judaism. They weren't taking them to their family. They weren't going home. They were going to Judaism. Sometimes that meant a Jewish orphanage, or like what they might call a children's home, or sometimes there were specific transport routes to try to get some of them to Palestine. I mean, in typical Jewish form, there was sort of like a disagreement about, there were different groups operating, they had different philosophies, they had different religious kind of orientations, so some wanted them to stay in more religious settings in Poland, others wanted them to go to, Israel or whatever, to British mandated Palestine at the time, depending on the year. But basically, that case, the idea of going in and removing the children hit this other really personal nerve for me, because when we were, with our daughters and made this decision for getting them hearing technology, we met a lot of resistance from some people who felt like the children should be growing up deaf. They should be with the deaf community. They should learn sign language or whatever. They had an idea of where and with whom our children belonged based on concept, like, that they are deaf, that they didn't grow cilia in their ear, or the cilia was bent and broken. This is how we determine where a child might belong. And I was like, well, what about who's connected and where the intimacy is, and who really loves this child? So when I heard this story about children being moved from home to from one place to another on the basis of, say, the Judaism or whatever, I wondered about the child and the sense of belonging and the sense of kind of the questions they would have about identity, sense of self, sense of faith, all the kinds of things that might happen when you're moved, displaced. So I'm gonna say just, I don't know how many of you have read Once We Were Home, but it weaves together more than this narrative, which when I started writing the book, it was about these two characters, Oscar and Anna, who are these Jewish children stowed in a Christian setting, and then a Jewish operative comes and retrieves them. But I was thinking that, I don't know, I ended up learning of another case where Jewish children were put into Christian settings like convents, and when relatives came to reclaim them, the church actually took them on the run. And there's like some historical cases, I'm gonna show you some photos and talk about it. So there was like that movement to save their Christian soul. Like they even would baptize a child after, and they didn't want to have them for their salvation. So there was this move in a different direction of like adults moving children in accordance to some sort of ideological view. And then as I was looking into the movements of children, I also learned about the Germanization of many children, many children from Poland, but many other surrounding countries, although Poland, it was a large there was a very big like saturation of this happening in Poland, where children were taken because they could fit like the criteria, the measurements, the caliper measurements, the eye charts, etc., and be taken into Germanization centers. So there was Nazi soldiers taking children and putting them into Germanization centers, and all of these different movements of children and what it must be doing, like how these different children were gonna like reroute after such ruptures. So even though the cases are really different and I don't draw any moral equivalency between the ways in which the children were moved, I was interested in the idea of all these different kinds of children facing the same kind of challenge of struggling with belonging, etc. after. So let me show you a little bit of like historical undergirding. There's a picture to the far, it's your left, I guess. And this young woman is, probably in her 20s, and she's moving children. She has kind of gone and retrieved, and there was like very specific routes that they took because of where children's homes were located. And in my novel, Oscar and Anna are moved according to a real transport route that is in parts of Poland, and then to Bavaria, and then to parts of Marseille, and then to a ship. And in the case of my characters, they get rerouted on their way and have to spend some time in Cyprus. But this is based on historians who have interviewed and learned a lot from most of the operatives who did this work, and then also many of the children who were moved. And it's interesting with respect to this particular movement that I study in the novel, which is, first of all, there were some like real linguistic disagreements about what you call this. Like, some of them were, at first some people were saying that they were rescuing the children, that the operatives were rescuing, but that there was like a backlash to that because the sort of righteous Christians who housed them were the rescue families, and they didn't. And so then they would say, we're redeeming them, or we're retrieving them, and some called it ransoming because they were offering money, etc. So there was this, even within it, there was sort of a question of what it is, and I thought it was very interesting that like maybe there's not even a vocabulary for what happened. I mean, the kids were stowed for supposedly initially a short-term saving, and then the parents died, so they don't really have parents, but they were with this family. They don't really have papers because they were stowed sort of in hiding. And then people came back to try to get them. And what even was that? Like, what is that? And so it's when I talked to that operative, she used the words like, I would go into the fields and I would steal the children. She used the word steal, she used the word kidnap, and at the same time she used the word save. And so there's just a real confusion about what this was and how you think about it. These photos are of Robert and Gerald Finley, who kind of undergird my character of Roger, who these two boys were put into a Christian nursery at first and then moved into a convent setting, and a relative survived, an aunt, actually weirdly by the last name Rosner, survived and went to try to get her nephews, and the church at that time baptized them and took them into hiding and wouldn't return the children. And there was a professor at Brown who went as soon as some certain archives opened and saw that the order to not let those children go back to Judaism went way high up in the papacy. Like the order came from way on high to not return them to Judaism, to have them grow up Christian. And, you know, there were plenty of clergy who were doing their best to try to take care of Jewish children in hiding without kind of moving them into Christianity. You had to maybe join communion if you were going to not stand out, but they weren't trying necessarily to convert you. There was such a range of how people acted in the war. I mean, in every case, it seems that there's just this giant range of humanity. But I did model my case of Roger on kind of the movements that occurred for the Finley brothers, because I was just fascinated by, you know, the particulars, especially that they were baptized after the war, after relatives came to reclaim them, and then once they were baptized, they didn't want to give them back as it would injure, you know, because of trying to keep them in the church. And this set of photos is photos from the Germanization process, measurements with calipers and other things, the eye charts, etc. You'll see there's a boy there with a rather big mole on his head, and that child's probably was rejected for Germanization because these kinds of you know, things like that would have disqualified. And if you were disqualified, if you were very young, they might have returned you, but for most of those children, they were just put into labor camps or they were put into concentration camps. And so it was just crazy how many children were moved during and just after World War II. And that's like ultimately what Once We Were Home really is about, this sort of movement of children and the aftermath and how they regrouped after and how they found belonging and like sense of self. This is just actually a little image board that kind of guided how I was developing each person's character and things children played with and things like that. And I think I can escape this. This will be done. Actually, how do I escape this? Here. So, you know, there were so many things to be considering too. Like when you think about children. Yeah, thanks. Thank you. In the case of like the Jewish children that were stowed in these Christian settings, you know, I was really interested in the range of reaction. So depending on your age, depending on your memory, depending on the relationship you forge, it will be a different experience if someone comes and tries to take you and move you out. If you're treated like a farmhand versus like a son or daughter, it's a really different experience. If you're 3 when you're put into this new family and don't really remember your first family, it's a totally different experience. But if you're 7 and you remember Shabbat dinner and you remember, you know, your aunt coming over and you remember all these things, having the idea that you might return to your Jewish roots may feel very different to you. So all these factors also made it different. And I was basically just really struck by the moral complexity of some of these child movements, and also the kind of thing we share in looking, like I tried to weave together several strands of child movement, and what was sad about it was if I had had the talent, I probably could have woven 17 strands together, you know, because there are so many different cases in which people have been trying to move children. And I mean, you know, luckily it was kind of confined to a very specific time frame and a specific area during World War II, but it's happening. It happens at the border. It happens it's happened in Canada with Indigenous people. It just happens. It keeps happening. Russian soldiers take Ukrainian children. There's just so many situations in which the situation is that we do that. And I kind of wanted to look at it all together, even though it in some sense made a more unwieldy narrative. And then there was the challenge narratively to sort of how you kind of feather these stories together. How are you going to do this? And my choice was to have that they all ended up in Israel under different conditions. And Israel itself, maybe in some sense, is a character in this novel. But one thing I thought was also interesting is about them ending up in Israel is that I didn't then need to do something very large or kind of dramatic because, one might be tempted to do something strange, like I was in the Stolen Children's Conference of 1990 or something, but there was no need to do anything like that because in Israel, especially post, at this time frame, if you walked into a wood shop and someone, you asked them about their nesting boxes or their chess set or whatever, you don't need to have you don't have to have a conversation that says, oh, I was taken from my home or whatever. All these different children who moved to Israel after the war had some experience of this displacement that they shared. And so the feathering together of narratives, like thematically, just ended up meshing because of the way this country sort of was built and who was built by. And so I thought that was really interesting. I should also say that there were historians who because I was in touch with many Israelis in the kind of research process of once we were home, and now it turns out I'm in touch with them on a daily basis. But there was this one historian who she was very generous, and in fact I sent my manuscript. A friend of hers translated it to Hebrew. She gave me all these different comments, and then the friend translated those back. We went back and forth in this incredible way, and she was a really persnickety historian as well. And so she, it was only it was like 5 times around until she's finally like, I get this picture of them like clinking glasses together, like all the history was kind of straight. But what I thought was fascinating about her work is that she really managed to interview so many of the operatives who retrieved Jewish children, and many of the children. And what I read when reading some of those interviews was, in some cases a real retrospective questioning of whether it was the right thing to do, whether it was worth it for certain, for them to move certain children because of the relationships, because of how rooted they had been in their, what you would call their rescue home. And one of these operatives followed the children that he had moved over, quite a long time, and sort of saw that for some they readjusted and they found their way. They were happy in Palestine, except most of them on a kibbutz. And then others just were dealing with psychic damage for so long, and it just couldn't really shake it. And I tried to represent that in my different characters in terms of, their experiences and what happened afterward, how they connected afterward, and whether they were on the search to kind of go back to try to reunite those families, etc. And most of that stuff is, each of the narrative choices I made, it tracks at least 1 or 2 people I interviewed or talked to who would have done that. Like, I met a woman who had a rescue family, and she went again and again, and when the parents of the family died, she would visit the sons or the daughters. I mean, they were just very, very connected, and that connection kept going, kept on and on. So I'm trying to think what else I want to share with you. Well, I was lucky to do a lot of travel, so I ended up, in some ways the research for my first novel, The Yellow Bird Sings, sort of, undergirded also Once We Were Home. And so, I was then able to go to Poland to see various settings of that novel, and go to Jerusalem and to Tel Aviv and see, be able to place Roger in a certain neighborhood where his aunt and uncle lived, etc. And so there was a lot of that as well. So, and then and meet some of the historians in person and really to, flesh out and talk about the subject matter. So it was very important to me for this type of historical fiction for it to be kind of rooted very carefully in history, and to make sure that history, that I was accurately portraying aspects of the history, even though every person in the novel is complete fiction, and I took my liberties, like had a philosopher, a burgeoning philosopher in there, and maybe I'll stop there and see if you have any questions. Although, actually, I want to say, before I stop, that in developing Renata, this girl who was Germanized, I wanted to represent the experience of someone who doesn't remember the movement that happened because this is also true, like in looking at documentaries, there were people who found out only very, very late in life that they were, a Polish child, but then they had been moved to Germany when they were very young. So I was in a position of where I wanted the reader to know things that my character couldn't know. So if I was in my character's point of view, I couldn't share the information, which is why there's this little Matryoshka doll, where I end up narrating interstitial chapters of the novel from the doll she's been holding in her hand when she was taken by soldiers and then moved into this home in Germany. So this little doll goes on this whole movement with her and is the one who kind of is the witness to her life. So that was kind of a decision to make, because I wanted to represent the fact that there are ways in which this history kind of unraveled, and sometimes the subject of it didn't even know that it had happened, depending on their age, and it seemed really significant to me. You could go through your whole life and maybe never know. There are so many things like that in this history, where you're wanting to try to represent the difficulties where, like with reunification of a mother and daughter who haven't been together for a long time, and maybe everyone would like to see like some giant hug, like an Oprah Winfrey and the big runway ending and all these things, but in fact, it's fraught and complicated because they've been separated for 20 years and the child's been waiting and waiting for their mom, and the mom didn't show yet, and the mom's been trying to find the girl who couldn't, and like all these kinds of things. And so you have a choice, like I feel like a choice as a historical fiction writer to represent those struggles in terms of sort of never forgetting, like to try to really animate those kinds of experiences rather than kind of take the route that probably everyone hopes for, but isn't realistic. Yeah. So it's a choice. But I think maybe if it's all right with you, I'll just read the very first section of the first Matryoshka, just so you can hear one bit of it in my own voice. From primeval forest to ribbon tree, from stout trunk to husked log, I wait. Fine wood shavings drift and swirl, matting the floor like a page upon which stories will be written. I might become a bird with ruffled feathers, a knight astride a whinnying horse, a top that spins around and around. I might become a boy's prized notebook, or a girl's tiny doll, solid to the core and brightly painted. When I'm released from the carver's hand, pink circles gloss my cheeks, and flowers travel my red coat. My family's song sets the rhythm of my heart as I nest inside my mother, inside her mother, inside her mother. One inside the other, we are gifted to a little girl. She chooses me, the smallest of our set, to take with her wherever she goes. Round framed eyes, a polka dot behind her ear. It is her lost history that I alone will remember. Together, the girl and I skip and swing on playgrounds and weave through the holiday markets. We marvel at the decorated eggs, bright and intricate. I'm painted simply, but the girl doesn't mind. At home, while my family nests, we sit at the table as her mama spoons plum dumplings into bowls and her papa says grace. We are in the park one morning when we spot the toy soldiers. They speak strange words, sharp and halting, their eyes cold like wolves. They are not toys. The girl screams when they grab her. She calls out, "Mama, Mama!" I call out too, thrust inside the girl's pocket, my shouts trapped in the folds of lining and wool. We are jostled and blounced to the steady clatter of a train. Though the girl is measured head to toe and given a different name, she's still the same inside. She reaches for me when we enter a house with the mingled smells of pretzels, burned sugar, and chestnuts. She cries for home, for her mama, but she lets the lady with velvet brown eyes lead her to a table to drink cups of milk, squeezing me tight, my red flowered coat peeling off in her hot, padded grip. In time, the girl will settle here, abandoning me for a toy broken into 100 pieces. She'll spend hours fitting it back together. She'll eat the lady's frosted cakes and listen to the man's fanciful stories. Just before sleep, she'll play with me, sugar on my braids. things. So maybe I'll stop there and we can have a question and answer session.
That was a lovely part to hear it at the end and, appreciate what that meant to that little girl and the treasures that some of the children had. I think we've got a question here.
Wow. I just found what you said so fascinating. You did such a fabulous job of sort of setting the scene and the story. I don't think it's black and white, but I was wondering as you were doing your research, and now, from an ethical point of view, you talked about people who were kidnapping the children back. And then you didn't say as much from the children's point of view, but perhaps that's in your book. But what do you think from an ethical point of view to take children who've already had trauma and to sort of, quotes, rescue them by taking them back?
Yeah.
Was it worth it? Was it the right thing to do?
I mean, that is really at the heart of this novel. And the novel it's narrated from the children's points of view. And so you really start seeing the differences between how different children adjusted and reacted and responded. And I mean, in terms of the ethics of it, I think it's a really blurry and difficult situation, because I think that the moral tension is between the collective and the individual. There is this sort of imperative to try to rebuild the collective, but then for each individual child, it was really different. And like I said, depending on
even within that one family, a sister and her brother, there was a difference in how they felt.
It really
you showed so clearly.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it depended on things like, if they were really attached to that second family, ripping them out and saying you should go to Judaism, which is very conceptual, right? It's not like you're going home. And then often those things were like a children's home or, at the kibbutz at that time. You'd be in the children's room and whatever parent was on, whatever person was the parent that night would be your parent. So it was really hard for some kids, and probably it wasn't right for them. And then maybe for others, they kind of rebuilt and they kind of found their way. And so it's interesting too, you might interview some, and I think there have been interviews where they're glad they got back into Judaism. And there are people I interviewed much older. There was a woman who she hid on a farm in plain sight wearing a cross. She was, really found some solace in the church at that time. Her mom actually lived and came and brought her back. And she couldn't find her way to Judaism until she was probably, 75. But then was happy that she found, it's really hard to say. I think it was very individual, like the outcomes, and then, I don't know, some overarching moral judgment. I probably can't make that. I just think that there was a lot of moral tension, and like when the woman called it saving, I just couldn't quite go with that, because I felt like, maybe for some or maybe for the collective, but there were definitely children for whom it was not a saving. It was a real huge rupture. And then this challenge of rerooting after that rupture was very profound.
And then there was the whole passion of the Zionist movement and the zeal to just get to Israel and escape all this terrible stuff that had been happening in Europe, and that motivated a lot of these young people as well, I would imagine, who were trying to rescue these children.
Yeah, there was a big thrust toward getting, at least from Zionist groups, getting them to what became Israel.
You mentioned some of the funding organizations. Who were these organizations, and where did they source their funds?
Yeah, there were funds. There were some rabbis who were raising money. There were some who were coming from Palestine area. There were some in the States. There were different kinds of fundraising that was going on. The Joint we had very specific. They would fund, but not the particular actual ransoming of the children. So they wouldn't give money to pay the Polish family, but they might give the clothes and the whatever. There were like some, which actually indicated the moral blurriness from the start, I think, of that. So there's a great book called Dividing Hearts by an Israeli, the historian actually who read my book, and she goes through all of this, the funding sources, the different ideologies of the different, so ultimately there were several groups who were doing this work of trying to retrieve the children. And then some of them kind of coordinated and others didn't, depending on, essentially, in some sense, their religious kind of underpinnings. And, I also should say that the guy who, really, one of the guys who followed them, followed those children for a long time and had a lot of retrospective regret about what he did, he had come up with things that were like these major ruses. Like first of all, he would fake powers of attorney. He'd come with someone in uniform with try to bully the families. And then, at one point he printed up fake wedding invitations and, told this family that there's a relative who's getting married, so they went to the dressmaker and the Polish mom is sitting in a chair outside and the girl goes into behind the curtain to change into dress and they hustle her out the side. And the mom is just sitting there waiting and the girl's gone. They just would do anything. They wanted to get those children. They felt they had to get them. And some of the children were really kicking and screaming to go, when they were being taken. And others were kind of curious about it because maybe they had memories that they were hopeful, and there were distortions, they might think they were going to see their parents again, even though all the evidence showed that they probably wouldn't, but there were hopes like that were kind of left vague so that maybe they would. It was really complicated.
Is there any estimate as to the number of rescues?
Yeah, all told, it's interesting. It's not a high number. In the Germanization case, there's a lot of disagreement about those numbers too, but there's something like hundreds of thousands of children who are taken. In the case of these sort of Jewish children in Christian settings that were trying, it ended up being in the end something like 600 or 700 children, not that many children. But and apparently the money offered initially, or the money accepted initially would be smaller, and as this process went on, they were demanding more money, and so they were trying to raise more and more money even for each singular child. So that was an interesting evolution, which I think also slowed down the number of children they could get.
So there may have been more.
There were more, yes.
How could they find them?
Yeah, it was hard to find. There were different ways of trying to find them. So like I said, the woman I spoke to said she would go tavern to tavern, There were programs, at least in Poland, of trying to provide support for Christian families who had rescued children. And that was a way of finding the children, saying, we're going to come and fund, give you some money. And then it kind of, and so then they were like, well, could we get the child back? We'll pay you this amount. So there were various strategies, but it was overarchingly very disorganized, and they were searching, and it wasn't systematic in any way. It's interesting when you think about this, because when you're trying to hide a person, you really don't want to leave evidence or trace, right? But then when you're trying to find them later, you wish you had that evidence. And that's one of those interesting things, like Irena Sendler, who buried jars in her garden with the names, they'd have the Jewish name and the kind of assumed Christian name. If those ever had gotten unburied at the wrong time, those children would have died. And I'd heard these stories too of names in 5 different notebooks. The notebooks spread over geographic areas, and then you try to get the notebooks back together. The problem afterward is when you couldn't get things back together and there's just no trace anymore. So if a person who knew I stowed them at this farm died, they weren't trying to spread the word. Although, for instance, in the case of the Finley brothers, the parents, told their siblings, if you survive, go to this convent and get my kids. But yeah, so it was a kind of a tricky thing, the sort of trying to stay silent and hide, and at the same time find a way to get them back. Yeah.
Gustavo?
Yeah, I have a question. Two questions actually. Why do you think that it's important to write about Holocaust? And the other thing is, during your research, you have the opportunity to learn about the generational trauma and how that passed and what are the effects on these kids.
Yeah, I think that people write about the Holocaust for different reasons. Some are trying to bring stories forward and have people really empathize and understand these are individuals, and sometimes things get so overwhelming when it's statistics, or sometimes in a way, why to pick fiction rather than nonfiction is another question. And I just feel like, I could have maybe told these particular historical stories, but I couldn't use subtext, and I couldn't, what I can add to this is, in some sense, is actually emotional resonance in a certain way through fiction. And so, I don't know, I think for me, what got me to my desk every day was something really personal about, who makes these, the idea of people sort of stating about where and with whom children belong was really kind of pressing on me in a certain way personally. With respect to the Holocaust itself, I think it's a subject that it's so hard to process humanity acting this way that you feel compelled to keep trying to figure it out. It's hard to let go because it's just unfathomable. It's like the unthinkable, and then how do you conceive of that? What is that? I just think it's a thing that people return to because it's impossible to understand in some way, and yet, here we are. And as regards epigenetics and that kind of inherited trauma, I'll say, I've interviewed many survivors, and what I find interesting is, you go in to someone's home, and it looks like so much adjustment. Like they have this beautiful home, and there are pictures of their grandchildren's bar mitzvahs, and they've made this life after the Holocaust. But then after several hours of talking, you realize that there's this incredible amount of acute pain that has not gone anywhere. It's there, and then you think of children today, and you think you're going to be 75 or 80 talking to some writer, and it's going to be this pain that's especially the children they were elderly then, but they had been separated from their parents. The range of emotions with respect to guilt and shame and all these other things that really don't make intellectual sense. Your parents gave you up to live, that this was a way to save your life, but somehow the rejection of it, even though it's not rejection, it was to save, but it feels emotionally like this. This is what I found in talking to people. There are this complex of emotions. And there's an author, Elizabeth Rosner, who wrote Survivor Cafe, and it's very much about the epigenetics of trauma, and it's a brilliant book, and I think she can speak to it much better than me. I think that we've seen how it is. We know about cortisol, right? We know about all the things that we know that it's practically it's like a cellular thing, and that trauma gets passed in this way. And that's the thing about the trauma of the world at this minute, is that all this is happening, and there's, to little children, and if they're lucky enough to survive, it's so painful. It's very painful.
Is there something some insights that you learned that surprised you?
Well, I have to say, what I found really surprising was there were these sort of large historical things that I just hadn't, after so much research I had done, hadn't known about. This whole thing about going in and retrieving children from these settings. I had heard specific anecdotes, in a convent, sometimes a rabbi would go and they would sing a lullaby or Shema or whatever, and that if a child stirred, sometimes the clergy would say there were no Jewish children here, we didn't do that, whatever, and a rabbi would come and sing a song, and they would you could tell a child was stirred, and they would be I think this is a Jewish child. I had heard that kind of story, but I hadn't heard of sort of what you might call as really concerted mission of a lot of operatives going in and trying to retrieve children like that. So I don't know if there was, I think that there were many individual stories that were surprising to me, really kind of stranger than fiction things, where if you went to your editor, they'd be that's ridiculous. And you're yeah, but I just talked to this woman who told me that she brought her goose with her to the bunker, and then her dad told her there was money in this pipe, so she went later and it was all rubble, but then she saw this teeny little shard of a plate, which is the plate they fed their goose on, and then she found the pipe and found money. Like, there were stories like that all the time where I was like, honestly, I couldn't even pass this off if I were just saying I'm writing a story and it has to do with the goose in the bunker and the shard of the dish. And so, like, there were always things like that. But these larger movements, I thought were really surprising to me, you know. And I thought it's like a big part of, in a sense, like that, it's a really little known history. And even like the Finley case, which was a big sort of made a big splash at the time, there was a lot of writing about it. It's not something people really know of, like that the church would like kidnap children, take them over the mountains, try to hide them, and then like there were court orders and clergy in jail and all this kind of stuff defying the courts just to do anything to not give back the Jewish children. And yeah, I mean, I just found these three movements of children actually to be, in general, really surprising.
Did you have a question at the back that I think
No, that was Indigo.
it was answered?
Just what happened to the two brothers whose picture?
Oh, they're alive in Israel. Their aunt got them eventually. You know, after like I said, in that case, there were arrests and all the stuff with the clergy. They were really hiding him, and they went on the run. But they eventually prevailed, and they ended up in Israel. Yeah.
I wanted to say that one of the things that really came out as the story went on, and they ended up, I guess I shouldn't say too much about the story for the people that haven't read it, but you know, just the yearning that came through. You know, you talked about how it was the emotion that really drew you into the story and that captivated you. And I thought that came through so clearly. There's just a bit of a paragraph about one character who talks about his parents were taken from him, murdered, and all his life he's been consumed with uncertainty, not knowing who he is or what he believes. He was brought up in a convent. He didn't know what to believe or where he belonged, and then he found love, but found out that she had a complicated history that would make it difficult for her to be accepted by his newly found Jewish family. And he found that he could connect with this person endlessly, and they were happy. She seemed to understand him, to be like him, only he can't, you know. So just, you know, just that yearning was so powerful in the book. I thought you did a beautiful job on it.
Thanks. Thank you. Yeah, I think this probably comes from talking to people who were like really longing for not just, I mean, you know, if separated from your family, this like sort of endless longing for that connection, but really the children who were moved in this way, I think struggles with like really also like, you know, how to connect, and then if you can finally find a way to connect. And then especially faith, I think Roger goes through a lot of that. He really doesn't know, like, because a lot of the kids who were hidden in these settings found solace in the church. You know, they found the music and the sort of orderliness and the you know, just like very, in some sense, really sensory things like the smells and the candles and all these things. And then they were moved to, you know, in the Jewish situation, it might have been like a much more kind of chaotic and passionate, you know, whatever situation, and less orderly, and it was destabilizing. Sometimes that's how that's in some stuff I've read. It just felt very hard to like adjust to that.
Another trauma.
Yeah.
So the Finley brothers, they were like Roger, and they lived in a convent and were baptized and everything. So do you know how they processed the switches between Judaism and Christianity?
Yeah. So, and actually, there's a guy, like I mentioned, this scholar at Brown named David Kurtzer, who's done a lot of work on the Finley brother case, and he's in touch with them, I think, closely, or at least one of them, maybe the older one. But I think at least for one of them, it was really hard. And there's a line in my. I give Roger a line that I really grabbed from the Finley case, which is where at one point Roger says something like, "Well, I am still a little bit Christian," you know, and that was a sort of a steal from the Finley brothers situation, because it was very hard to kind of especially like imagine just like you're this kid who's just, you know, put into this incredibly regimented situation in the convent, and how you move through your day every day, you know, and it's obviously a immersive religious experience. And then you're taken to this other situation, which may in its own way be quite immersive too. But you're praying now, you know, that you're at least your aunt and uncle are praying to a different God, and this is happening, and you know, and he would go in, like in you know, Roger's case, he would go in the garden. But I think that it was somewhat similar. It was a bit fraught for a while, and now they're in Israel, and I think they're adjusted and happy, and they have both found their way. Yeah, and again, that might also be an impact of your age, and all your memories would be a big thing in that. And all the relationships and the new formed relationships, and how you really do connect to your aunt, this random lady who comes to get you, you know, like all those things seem to be so particular. Yeah.
What's the time frame for a lot of the average time frame that they were away between when they were put with the Christian families and when they were, was it 3-4 years, or was it?
I mean, it really also varied depending on, like, at the point when someone was able to secure a place to stow their child. I mean, in some sense, by 42, if you hadn't stowed your child by 42, you know, by the kind of, I don't know, probably March of 42, you know, that child would end up on a transport with, you know, so.
Are you talking about Poland in particular, or?
Yeah,
because Hungary was different, wasn't it?
Yeah, that is true. I mean, I have been, most of all of my, like, kind of reference points have been Polish, especially because I've been researching for these children. But so I think that, you know, it could have, and again, depending on the age of the child, but it could be you know, it could be 3 years. It could be, you know, it could be a substantial amount of time. It could have been longer if parents had figured this out soon, you know, kind of decided and made this decision sooner. And so that's not an insubstantial amount to be like living in another
So
home.
if you're free at the beginning, or
Yeah,
totally
yeah.
Something else that you pointed out was that often the children's lives were, if they were that aware, you know, not just little toddlers, but slightly older, they would have been aware of the fact that there was a lot of anxiety in the home, and that they felt insecure and threatened and terrified, and their parents were terrified. So going to some place like a convent or a farm, even though it was terrifying and unfamiliar, it also presented some solace for them.
Yeah, the other thing that's interesting is that, you know, it was really dangerous to be Jewish, and they were told to suppress, hide, you know, don't pee on the tree or whatever, because you could be, like, they were trying to hide themselves. And then when people came to take them back to Judaism, that was shocking. Like, some kids just burst into tears. They were so scared that they were going to something dangerous. You know, so they had to get used to it being okay to hear Yiddish or to hear Hebrew spoken, and it was that itself was very triggering for some children. I read that again and again, because, you know, you go through this many years thinking, like, you know, that this is a death sentence, and then you are just said, hey, we're coming back, you know, going back to that. It was scary. Yeah.
From the time you first conceived of this idea till the finished copy that's standing in front of us, what kind of timeline is that?
Yeah. I mean, I heard that when I met that woman, the operative, that was quite a while. It's been bouncing around in my head for a while, because I don't know, I couldn't let it go, but I didn't know what to do with it either. I mean, I concertedly wrote the novel, I'd say, in a couple of years, but it also was built on a lot of research I had done for the other novel. So, I mean, I don't know, my first novel, you know, from the time I got the first idea when that woman told me that she'd been in a shoemaker's attic to when it came out was like a 10 years. And then this one was much faster after, but honestly, it's like probably a 5-year average because of that. But I also should say, I remember when, you know, I was going from, you know, life and philosophy to, I had written this memoir to, I was going to try to write a novel. And I remember being on like page 11 for like, I think 3 years. You know, the page, it was a different 11 pages, but I never could get past page 11. Like, so, you know, someone would be like, how's it going? I'm like, I'm on page 11. And like, yeah, like they kept changing, but I just couldn't, I could not get, and yeah, and it was similar where, you know, with the first novel, someone, you know, I'd say like, I would go on a walk by the river where I live, and someone would say, what are you writing? And then there's this, you know, little, you know, child and her mother in a barn. And then like really 3 years later, I'm like, there's a child and mother in a barn. Yeah, it just took a while. So this one went faster, but something that was really interesting too from a writing standpoint is in The Yellowbird Sings, they're hidden in an enclosed area and they can't really talk or move. They're in a very static situation, which is what hiding in a barn would be like. And so the pacing kind of, in some sense, like the development of the narrative matched the pacing of their lives. Whereas in this one, the children are like sort of very like moved here, then moved here. And I found that like the writing itself moved like that too. It was like weirdly copying the pacing of their lives was how it was moving for me. So that was really interesting. I don't know what it's about, but you know, every single project seems really different. And I feel like basically, maybe you'll be able to speak to this, but it just seems like you're just at the bottom of the mountain again, and like it's a totally different mountain, and you're like, I know how to walk, but and you know, like
It's like your children, you know everyone is.
yeah, everyone is different. Yeah, exactly.
So what's next for you, Jennifer? What do you have in the
Yeah, I am working on a novel that is an attempt at really sharing like all the various points of view in like the world of deafness, because I feel like so it is, you know, there's a particular character and you know she goes through a story, but I wanted to really represent all sides because I feel like it's most of what I can find out there seems always sort of in a biased position and not really sharing the whole kind of mess of it, but I also think that that particular fractiousness is mirrored in our larger world, and I'd like to be able to shed light on that through this particular subject.
Interesting. Are you past page 11?
I am. I am. Now whether I'll delete that until I don't know, but yeah. So
Well, should we wrap it up then? Romy's going to come up. Romy Friedman.